Welcome everyone to our Grad School 101 event workshop titled Setting Expectations with Your PI. This webinar is a part of a workshop series from the Científico Latino team. And we are a mentorship program known as the Graduate Student Engagement and Community Program, also known as the GSEC. Throughout the panel, we encourage you all to submit any questions in the chat for me or to Sergio in order for us to ask panelists. And they're all anonymous, and we'll also be recording. Today's webinar consists of our esteemed GSEC mentors here, Ela Contreras and Julio Fierro. And unfortunately, our third panelist, Amy Scalera, could not be with us today, but will join our future panels to come. I wanted to welcome today Ela, who is a Cell and Developmental Biology graduate student at Vanderbilt University, and Julio, who is a Molecular Biosciences graduate student from the University of Utah. And so during this hour, they will be discussing topics on how to set expectations and boundaries when it comes to communicating your needs with your PI. But before we get into the discussion, I wanted the panelists to give us a brief introduction regarding their research and their activities outside of the lab. So Ela, can you start?
Yeah, and so hello everybody. My name is Ela Contreras Panta. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the Cell and Developmental Biology department from Vanderbilt University. And so just a little bit about me. I'm an international student, so I came here to the US back in 2018 through a wonderful opportunity through the program REPU, Research Experience for Peruvian Undergrads. So I did an internship here as a university in Vanderbilt University. And I did an internship, and while I was doing that internship, I realized that grad school here, all the opportunities for grad school were here in the States were just, they seem to me wonderful because you get an stipend, or back in my country, it's a little bit different. And I learned here that when you do grad school here, when you do your PhD here, you can get an stipend for doing science, which to me seemed really great. Motivate me to apply to grad school. And so I applied to grad school, I applied to different schools, and I ended deciding to stay here in Vanderbilt University because I knew that the environment was really collaborative. I didn't feel any toxicity between or competition between the PIs, which it was great. Like, it seemed really great to me. And yeah, I started right before the pandemic, so in fall to 2019. And then, well, as we know, COVID hit, but so far, because so in my program, how the things work, it's basically, we do, my program is called, the program I came through Vanderbilt, it's IGP, the Interdisciplinary Graduate Program, and it's basically what we know as an umbrella program. So basically, during the first year, you do 4 rotations, and after the 4 rotations, you decide which lab to join. Because I knew how to, I had the chance to set expectations with my PI, or with the PIs I rotated after I rotated, and decided to join the one that gave me like a good, it felt like a good fit. When COVID hit, I wasn't like, I had the feeling that I was in good hands, like in a good lab environment that allowed me to just continue doing good work and like just continue, keep going, even though we were through the pandemic and everything.
Stay here. I mean, sorry, Julio.
No worries. Yeah, so my name is Julio Fierro. I'm a third-year student in Dr. Minoru Johnson's lab here at the University of Utah. Very briefly, like, I studied the evolution of cell substrate adhesion machinery and worked with this really weird amoeba called Dictyostelium. Check out my Twitter if you want like pictures of that kind of stuff. Anyway, yeah, so I'm originally from Mexico, but moved to the United States when I was 5. I actually moved to Salt Lake, so I grew up in Utah. I went to Harvard for my undergrad, and then after graduating from there, decided to take a couple gap years. So I joined the Department of Human Genetics here at the University of Utah as a tech for one of the labs. And it was while I was here that I got a reminder of why I loved growing up in Salt Lake so much. So I'm a very outdoorsy person in terms of like activities outside of the lab. I like to trail run a lot, like go hiking, camping, all that fun stuff. And Utah is probably the best spot in the whole entire United States for it. I may be biased, but you know. But it was partially because of that, but then also just the environment at the University of Utah that convinced me to stay here instead of taking offers from other schools that I thought I would definitely go to if I got in. So kind of like Vanderbilt, it sounds like a lot of the PIs here are very collaborative and care a lot about work-life balance, care a lot about making sure students are very happy. And like, that's one of the strengths of the program compared to, I think, a lot of other programs around the nation. And so when it came to like choosing my PI, I was actually very spoiled in that when I was rotating through labs and when I was talking to all 3 PIs that I rotated with, they were all very much on board with like having very upfront and very frank conversations about like what the expectations in their lab were, what they expected in terms of work-life balance, what they allowed students to do and not do. And a lot of those PIs were also just very upfront about it during like interview weekends. So I actually got a really good sense of like what life in a lab was going to be like here ahead of time, outside of my own experiences just as a tech. So yeah, so I went through the whole entire rotation process knowing that being with like PIs that would allow me to have a really good work-life balance, that were maybe a bit more lenient about certain things, or like willing to let me take like mental health days or time off wasn't going to be a big issue as long as I communicated it well. And so I was very lucky in that thanks to those rotations, I was able to meet those PIs and work with them very early on. And then I also like joined a lab basically right as the pandemic hit, which was fun, kind of. But yeah, and so luckily because of that, like I definitely joined at like or maybe not luckily, but I joined at like a little bit of a weird time where like expectations were kind of like, wasn't really sure what you could and couldn't do. We couldn't go into lab physically for a while. But yeah, I think I've gotten very lucky in that like I had the privilege of working for a PI who's like really understands like work-life balance, like really understands like expectations, and is like very open to like negotiating that, or not negotiating them, but like discussing them and kind of adjusting them as need be.
Great, guys. Thank you so much. I actually forgot to kind of introduce myself. My name is Yanitza. I am an incoming graduate student at Yale University. I completed my first year as a graduate student at Brown University, but then decided to transfer to Yale. And along with Sergio, I am one of the Grad School 101 workshop coordinators. And I'm very happy and excited to have you all here. So let's jump right into the questions now that were submitted by some of our GSEC members when they signed up. The first question was, how do you ask your PI if you can be remote? And for example, if you're part of the computational sciences program.
So I guess I can go first. First, I don't have much experience on that, like computer science, because my project is basically wet lab. But I think that you just have to be honest and like just approach the PI and ask him, or tell him, well, since my project can do all this work from just using the computer, do you think you can ask a PI, do you think I can work from home and like have weekly meetings or monthly meetings through Zoom? Do you agree with that? And what's your policy on that? And just, I feel like you just have to be upfront and ask directly to the PI, because I had the feeling that most of the PIs will be, if it's a good mentor, like if the PI, it's a good mentor, I think it will agree that you don't have to go to lab basically to just work on a computer, unless you need a really well put together computer, like with a high capacity, because like I have heard, like at least here in Vanderbilt, I have heard that even some PIs have been willing to, especially during the pandemic, to just move the work computers, like the high power computers from here to the grad student houses, because yeah, like they couldn't come in to lab, and so working from home was working fine. And as the pandemic has developed, they continue just working from home, and that worked from then for them. So I think just in general, you just have to be upfront with the, if that's a possibility. And I feel like most of the PIs will be pretty chill about it, as long as you, I get the feeling that most of the PIs is that as long as you do progress, as you progress in your project, I think they won't be opposed to that idea. And it's could be a red flag with some PIs. So maybe you, if you are thinking on having like a heavy dry lab project, maybe discuss it during your rotation to just start getting a feeling of how the mentor is.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Ela said. I actually like to take work from home days, which turn into like work from coffee shop days for me. But like, if I have like a lot of data analysis and I don't need like a specific workstation or a specific program that is only going to be on like a lab workstation or like a core workstation, what I'll do is I'll just let my PI know like a few days ahead of time, that hey, like I'm gonna have this day where like I just need to do like data analysis, or I need to do all of this. It's all stuff I can do from home. Is it okay if I just work from home for that day? And yeah, my PI is really chill about it. I feel like most of the people in my cohort, their PIs are really chill about it. I've yet to hear of like a PI here that like, as long as you communicate it ahead of time, aren't okay with it. I think like the bigger issue might be if you just drop off the face of the earth for like a couple of days and like don't let them know everything. I think like there's also been instances where, for example, I've heard of people kind of going remote because they have like family emergencies or they have something come up and they're gone for like an extended period of time. So I had like one person in my cohort who worked remotely for a whole entire month, basically. And I think again, it comes down to communication, just letting their PI know like, hey, like here, if you're going to take like an extended amount of time for whatever reason, right? I think being honest with them about like, hey, I might need to take some time off because of this. Like, if that's the case, can we set up like a schedule like made to meet and like potentially hold myself accountable in terms of like doing work and like making sure that, you know, if they want to make sure that you're just not slacking off or like taking vacation, which I mean, we're all tempted to from time to time, right? Like just like having like a system in place where you can communicate with your PI and like make sure like you're letting them know like, hey, like I am doing work, or like, hey, like if you need me to do something to like on your end to like have this be a thing, like just let me know and like we can work something out.
Yes, totally agree. So the next question was, how do you negotiate expectations after a rotation? This is when you're deciding which lab to join.
I can go first for this one. I think it's actually really smart. I think the first way I approached that was to talk to like students in the lab actually ahead of time to get a general sense for like what like now that their students are kind of more established, they've had some time in the lab, like what are the expectations that they generally feel like they need to meet with a PI, right? Because I think PIs, of course, like I will always assume like a PI is a good person, right? But like the way like they perceive themselves and their expectations are probably skewed from what like other people perceive their expectations to be, right? So I think first talking to like students to get a general sense for what like those expectations usually are once you actually join a lab is like a good thing to do, just so you kind of have like a baseline to compare to. And then again, I think just like setting up a meeting with like a PI like right after your rotation finishes, like at the end of your rotation, like just to like if you're like catching up, like going over like, oh, like how did the rotation go? I think like being honest and being like, if I were to join your lab, like what are the expectations for students who join your lab? Like what should I expect? Like for example, like as somebody who barely joins, like as a second year versus like as things develop more and more and more, right? Kind of getting like a scope of like what you imagine like working in the lab would be like, and just like asking the PIs like upfront, like what do you expect out of a student, both in terms of like hours worked, for example, like amount of time you can take off, like independent work is also a big thing, because I think a lot of people might not realize like a PI might want them to be fully independent versus like kind of like leaning on them for support a bit more on depending on the mentorship style. So yeah.
Actually, I would chime in with that regarding when to schedule a meeting during your rotations with the potential PI, not only to be just at the end of your rotation, but maybe bi-weekly, so that they see that you're interested in joining their labs. So yeah.
I'm also not sure, kind of to add to that as well, like our program also really encourages to still meet with the PI like after we rotate with them. So like doesn't have to be like often, but like just keep in touch with them, especially if it's like one of your earlier rotations and you really like them, because there will be other students that rotate as well. And like there's no reason why you can't just drop by to like say hi and like talk for like 10 minutes and just catch up. It's also a good way to just build a network.
So yeah, I agree with pretty much everything what Julio said. So yeah, I just personally what I did was similar. I did ask around the other grad students, senior grad students, and ask them how the relationship was developed through the years with the. And I also in some of my rotations, the PI initially scheduled weekly meetings with me, but in the other two, in a couple of rotations, in the other two, I did ask the PI to meet weekly with me, because I start knowing how the relationship or start building a relationship with the PI and get to know during that rotation how is the mentoring style of the PI. So that's why I asked to meet weekly with them. And also at the end of the rotation, I just, in our last meeting at the end of the rotation, I asked them similar, if I were to join your lab, what's the expectations? I also, because I am an international student, I did ask them students funds the first 2 years of the grad students, so the international grad students. And after that, during your third year and later, the PI is the one in charge of your funding. And so, and due to that international students cannot apply to many grants, I did ask the PIs what was the situation, or how do they used to handle international students? Do you put pressure on them to apply to the very few available grants, or if there is an available grant that grad student wants to apply, they allow them, and you don't actually have to worry about funding because the labs will funded. So I did ask about that, about funding, because in my case, as an international student, was important to consider. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Are you hearing me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, my internet connection apparently is not great. So yeah, I did also ask them, because again, international student, when I want to go back to my country and want to visit my family, is it okay that I take at least 3 weeks of vacations, at least during holidays, and ask them how okay were they with, because again, international travel usually takes a couple of days back and forth. So that was also important for me. And I just, at the end of the, in our last meeting, I just asked upfront and try to get as much information from the PIs, and how they used to handle the grad students, especially international. How many conferences, for instance, the PIs wanted to the grad students to go, because I think one of the things that I really like is to do networking and try to make connections with other here in the country. And conference for me, before knowing COVID was happening, but conference for me were really important at the time. So I also asked what was their conference policy. Do they send their grad students or their trainees once a year, at least, to a conference? and so on. So I just like at the end in your last meeting, I think you should be at front and ask all the doubts you might have with the PI. And I think most of the PIs will be really honest about how they handle the grad students. And also good to know, it's good to know to us around to the grad students as well in the lab.
So keeping up the topic about expectations, another question that one of the GSEC members had was, what are the questions that you should ask the PI about expectations that others do not normally think of?
I think kind of like what Ela alluded to. I think conferences and grants is something that actually that's really important, right? Especially grants, because grants, especially like the first ones that you write, will probably take a while to write, and it'll be like quite an effort. So I think that's really important to ask them, like, do they expect you to apply? Oh, do they expect you to apply for your own funding as well? Like, you should be asking about funding in general. But if they have some expectation that you have to acquire your own funding in order to be in the lab, like they can't sustain you otherwise, that's really important. I'm trying to think what else. I think maybe like expectations based on what career path you want to go into, right? So like my PI like asked me like, oh, like where do you kind of see yourself? Like generally, like obviously things can change. So like I'm interested in academia, and so because of that, like if I want to have like a more academic oriented career, like my expectations for in terms of like what I might be focusing on in terms of like publications or like extracurricular activities that are linked to the sciences, but like might be something else like teaching, for example, right? I found that that's something that, especially if like you have a mentor that's really invested in like kind of specializing you and preparing you for like a specific career path, like their expectations of like what you're doing might change, or just the way you approach things, right? Like they might tell you like, hey, like you should be focusing on this instead of this other thing. Yeah, I mean, I think those are like the main things. I mean, maybe like the only other thing I can think of that people might not normally ask is just like maybe like interactions with like other PIs. I don't know. Like if you're especially, I guess maybe if you're like working on a project that like might include like multiple people, because I've had some friends that are kind of like that, where like they're on a project that includes a lot of other labs or groups. Like some of them were kind of caught off guard with like how often they were expected to like interact with those groups or like go to that group's lab meetings or stuff like that. So like if you're in a more like a lab that has a lot of those style of projects and you're probably going to be on one of those projects, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I think I have similar questions. So something additional could be that, and something that most people don't think about it is ask the PI how's their policy on allowing the students to take the summer off for to apply to internships, like summer internships for different career paths. For instance, in my case, I don't know, and even I don't know yet what I want to do after the PhD. And I knew that since my first year. So I basically asked because Vanderbilt has this great program or this great office, the Aspire program, which basically shows you and has models and internship opportunities in different career paths that usually take the whole summer. And so because I knew that and that there were these opportunities even for international students, I asked the PIs where I rotated in it, what was their policy on allowing the students to take even a whole summer off for exploring or doing these internships. And like just I told them I'm not completely sure what I want to do next, maybe a postdoc, maybe industry. And so I told them, and because Vanderbilt has this great program and there are these great opportunities that I am eligible to, I wanted to know what is your policy, like do you allow your students to do this, to apply to these other take even a complete summer off, and just get to know like if all the PIs, because it's part of Vanderbilt, that all the PIs told me, yeah. So that's one question. Also, another thing I can think of is, yeah, basically what I mentioned, like the conferences, how many conferences do you usually go, or do you want me as a student want to present in all the retreats, in all the fields, or how, like, do you have a minimum of conference that you will, or you want me to go to all of them, or something like that, right? It's just usually as we get into as we just start, I was really shy, but I still tried to ask as many questions as I could. And just remember that there is no dumb question, especially when it's related to your future next 4 to 5 years in your life, right? So if you have any doubt and any question that you want to ask the PI because you think it's going to be important down the road, there is no dumb questions, and just don't be shy and ask anything you want to know about the expectations with your PI.
If I could add one last thing, Yanni, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One thing that I also just came to mind, because it actually happened to my roommate, who's also in the same program as I am, is also ask your PIs if they expect you to do like side projects on top of like your own research. Because it's weird, like his PI like kind of expected him to kind of develop his own mini projects on the side in addition to his main project, just kind of like to do stuff on the side, and caught him off guard. Like it made him a lot busier than he was, and kind of made for some awkward meetings. So that is something to ask about, like if they expect you to do more stuff than just like your main thesis research, and then also how independent they expect you to be. Like, do you have a PI that you can just pop in at like any time and like ask a question or get help on things, or do they fully expect you to kind of figure things out on your own? And like I'll help you when I can, but like for the most part, you kind of have to do things on your own.
Yeah, something else that I wanted to add is maybe most people don't think about it, but it's important to ask the work-life balance. You can ask directly to the PI, but also around the lab, like the trainees. So I think it's really important to get to know that if the PI, it's really, because there are some PIs that expect you to even come during the weekends the whole day. And so that's a red flag, and that's not good, because you have, as a grad student, you have to have a work-life balance, because it's going to be terrible. It's really important to ask if the PI wants you to come, like even during the weekends, or a schedule that the lab or the PI wants you to follow, right? Because in my experience, I think most PIs will be good that you take you have your own schedule as long as you make progress in your project, right? But there are other cases that maybe the PI, because the PI is from 9 to 5 or to 6, they might want to see you from 9 to 6. So if you have any question or you want to discuss something, because the PI is there and you're also there, you have the opportunity to communicate. But I think because of all the pandemic now, and like we have seen that most meetings can be emailed sometimes. So I think it's really easy. I think most PIs will be good with you having your own schedule as long as you make progress in your project.
So another question that we had is, if your PI is very disorganized and your research feels like it lacks a clear direction, what is a good approach in talking to your PI? How can you bring up the expectations that you would like to have? Ela, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, you can call for a meeting, or you can ask your PI for a meeting and ask and tell, like, for instance, maybe you're in your 3rd year already, on your 4th year already, and you don't see, and you have like mini questions, open questions still, and like you don't see putting together a manuscript, or like that your project doesn't have a direction. Maybe you can call on the ask for the PI to have a meeting and to tell him, well, I am in the middle of the PhD, more or less, and I would like I would like to start having a sense of direction in the project. And if that doesn't work because the PI, it's like, it could be that it's a new PI and sometimes new PIs are in this exploratory pathway because they are new PIs, they just open the lab and they are figuring out what way to go. In that case, when the PI is not much of help, at least you can go to the members of your committee. So for instance, I don't know how in other programs work, but for instance, in my program, after the second year, after you finish your second year, you form sort of, they are kind of co-mentors as well. You will meet them in your committee meetings, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can meet them more often if you want, because they become as mentors to you. So if that doesn't help, like if the situation, if you don't see a direction and your PI is not so much of help, you can reach to the members of your committee, or maybe with other PI that it's related to the field, knows about your project, and you can ask for help to these other, any member of your committee or other PIs that might know you. Because I feel like if it's in their power, PIs will be pretty open to help, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything Ela said. I think a good strategy is to like be upfront with your mentor and be like, hey, like, I feel like a little lost in my project right now. Like, can we set up, for example, say like a monthly meeting, like hold them accountable too, right? Be like, here's what I want to do, like outline what you want to do. So I have a good idea of like what you want to do, especially if your PI is the one that's disorganized, like kind of, you're probably gonna have to lay it out for them to start. And then kind of be like, here's what I want to do, here's what I kind of want to accomplish by like, say like end of this year or like in end of 2 years. Can we meet monthly and just like have these monthly meetings where like I like update you on what's going on and you can let me know whether that's going well, like does that make sense, you know, and just reach out to them to talk about it, right? Because that's really, again, like the best form of communication is to do that, is to just, or the best thing to do is to just have that form of communication and just be like, hey, like, I don't know where things are, like, can we meet? And then like they can give you their feedback on like what they think about it, right? Do they think it's feasible? Do they think they're on the right track, right? But to a certain extent, you have to outline it for them at some point. Kind of like what was put in the chat, like you can't just, you don't know what your PI is thinking, right? So like your PI might have a different idea than what you do. And so like the best way to do it is to just lay it all out and be like, here's what I want. And I also agree, like in the event that it doesn't work out that way and say like for whatever reason, like you still feel like your PI is just either not invested or like something's going on, like they're just still kind of lost in the whole entire thing, take advantage of your committee. So our committees are set up in a similar fashion. So we make ours at the beginning of our second year before we do our qualifying exam, but they're meant to serve as like a safety net of sorts. It's actually really cool where like anytime we have a committee meeting, our PI gets kicked out for half an hour or like 15 minutes so we can talk to our committee, and they basically ask us like, is everything okay? And most of like 90, probably like 9% of the time that answer will be yes. But if you are in that 1% or however many percent, right, where you do feel like something's wrong, like you should let your committee know, right? Because your committee will be there to one, act as your controllers, also to kind of protect you to a certain extent, right? So yeah, I fully agree. Like use any co-mentors you might have. Committee members are also good, especially if they're like experts in like your area, probably get people to be like, hey, like if you just like do like a shock talk in front of them, like here's like what I have so far, does this make sense? And they're like, no, like it does not make sense, or no, here's like a bunch of holes, right? It will give you a good sense of just like where your project's at probably. So yeah, no, I fully agree with everything Ela said. Like take advantage of like forms of communication with your PI to like lay everything out, and like take advantage of your committee, especially in any co-mentors you might have.
Okay, so a very brief but very important question here is, how do you actually start the conversation? So how do you advocate or negotiate better expectations than what the PIs are generally used to giving?
I think being as honest about how you feel, right? Which sometimes I like, obviously, like that's easier said than done a lot of times, right? Because like they're going up to PI, there is a power dynamic regardless of how well you get along with your PI, right? And so that might be something that takes into account. But I think just being as honest and as level-headed as you can going into it is usually the best bet. I think also like probably going into the meeting not necessarily expecting to get everything you want, if I'm being completely honest, right? Like, so don't get me wrong, like there are definitely instances where like PIs will be more than like understanding, like most of the time I'd say, right? But there may be like some, if you do feel like, you know, you're going into a meeting where like your expectations with your PI differ substantially from like what you want versus what like kind of what their expectations are, right? Chances are you're probably going to have to like compromise at some point. But I think something that's really important again is to like go into that meeting like fully like prepared to like be honest and have that conversation, right? I think something that our program really encourages is like if you are kind of nervous about that meeting, like maybe identifying like either a co-mentor or a student or a postdoc, like somebody that you feel very comfortable with, or an advisor that you can kind of maybe like talk to as well, or like potentially even have them be there. So like my PI and I actually for a grant had to write out like a conflict resolution plan, which was really interesting because it kind of forced us to think about this question where like if I'm having like a conflict with Mina, my PI, and we have to discuss it and we can't like meet somewhere in the middle, what do we do? And like one of our plans is actually to like, for example, get like the head of the department involved or get like the director of graduate studies or something like that, right? And kind of to have it be like a third party, for example, like somebody you can trust that is like an outside third party that can kind of like mediate both sides if need be. But yeah, I think most of the time, so long as you go into it with like being honest and being reasonable about what you're going to get out of it, I think like, again, most PIs, like we've said throughout this talk, like I think most PIs will understand. And the extreme scenarios where they don't, or like they're being like super like, no, I'm not going to budge at all, and you do feel like it's unfair, that's where you can start to bring like other people in. And like departments will really care about that because they care about making sure that like that isn't a strained connection, because that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, the dean of student affairs is your best friend. So just as I know.
In what just Julio said, yeah, definitely honesty is the best policy, I will say. If you are upfront and just ask the PI what are your expectations, and ask him what are his expectations or her expectations, it should go well. And it's actually a good idea to have like sometimes when you cannot totally agree, I think it's a great idea to have like a third party to have accountability, or how to be like a deal breaker, right? Or to break the tie, to having a third person. So I think that's a great idea. And yeah, and like if you need help and like you are not so sure about the expectations, or like that so sure about the expectations either, like you can just go and ask for help to other mentors, to other PIs, and also and there is always the DGS, or in my department is the DGS, the Director of Graduate Studies. So yeah, it's your best friend. You can reach the DGS anytime you want. You might need help. So yeah, it's important. So start to know as you get into the university, get to know all the resources that are available for you. All not resources, but people that can lend you an ear, or like that you can go.
So for example, if you had any incongruencies with your PI, did you actually start the conversation? And if you really didn't see eye to eye with your PI, how is that process? What does that process entail? Like, who do you talk to first? Do you go directly to your PI, or do you go to the DGS or to the Dean of Student Affairs? Like, how would that be?
Yeah, I think kind of like what I mentioned earlier, like, well, I guess I've been lucky that like, I guess like the major incongruency I've had is just like we disagree about like what type of analysis I should do. And then I just do both. And then most of the time I'm wrong. But no, I think I'd say like I kind of mentioned, like we have that plan in place where I think the first thing we do is just like if we identify what the incongruency is between us, like what is like the expectation that Nina has versus what's the expectation that I have, how do they differ, right? Our plan is to kind of discuss it. So again, like I can mention like, hey, I don't agree with this, like I think I should be doing this or doing this. Whereas if it gets to the point where it's just like we still disagree, we still like kind of have a different, talk to the director of graduate studies about it first in our department, and like tell them like, hey, here's like the conflict that's going on, like we're not reaching an equal level, like would you mind like kind of like stepping in. But also because director of graduate studies for my department is somebody that my PI, for example, co-teaches with, so there's like a little potential conflict of interest there. We also have a plan to bring in another PI from outside the department who I'm really close to, who's on my committee, who like knows both of us pretty well, to kind of be even like a fourth party, just in case there is like a conflict of interest with that director of graduate studies. And yeah, and the idea is like between the four of us, we kind of come up with like a plan to like, okay, like from an outside perspective, here's what other people think is like a fair medium, and we work towards that, constantly updating them for like the next couple months. Like, are things going well? Do we feel like that compromise was fair? And if things aren't going well, then we revisit that situation and be like, okay, so like this clearly didn't work. What do we need to do now? And like, do we need to step in even further from there? But yeah, it's kind of, I've been lucky that it hasn't happened so far to me. And I haven't really heard of any people where it's gotten to that point. So I want to be able to walk you like step by step to like what to do in that situation. But like that's the plan that we have in place if it were to ever get to that point for whatever reason.
So yeah, I gotta say that I have also been very lucky that where I haven't had like major disagreements with my PI. But I have heard, and I know of some cases that the situation was really complicated between a mentor and a student. And here in Vanderbilt, at least, there is enough support for the students that you can even change labs. You can transfer to a different lab, and just so you know, it's not the end of the world if you do that. You just in the situation, the environment in the lab is not really good anymore, and you didn't think like the situation completely changed of as how you started, and it's really bad for you and for your mental health. Just reach the Dean of Student Affairs or the DGS or the person in charge of your program to ask for changing labs, and it's not the end of the world. It's you are putting yourself first. You have to put yourself first and take care of your mental health. So you have, it's not the end of the world changing labs. It could take you more time to graduate, but at the end of the day, it's your health is what important. It is more important. So yeah, that's also an option, at least here in Vanderbilt, and I don't know if in other universities, but I imagine that it should be similar because, yeah, you matter as a student. You matter, and you have to put your mental health first. So, and just going back to how to meet with your PI. So before going to a really high degree or a person over your PI, I think you just have to be honest and approach. Well, this is happening. This is how I am. This is how I see the situation that's going on. I don't know if you have a different perspective, because again, we don't know what the PI is thinking. So just meet with your PI first and ask tell how you're feeling, how the expectations that your expectations maybe are not meeting. And so just go first. And if that doesn't work, just reach out to other people, yeah, and start asking for help outside your PI.
A question in the chat aimed to ask about what should I look for in choosing a PI? So I'm guessing like, should you look for a lab that's like bigger or a smaller lab? Because both of them have very different expectations as well. And also like, what do you think about the work-life balance? I know that we've been talking about this before, but how can you maybe bring that up to them?
Depends on like what PI you. So how is a mentoring style that you prefer or that fits good with you? Because it depends on the to have a PI or a mentor that is really hands-on and like having weekly meetings with you and like being paying a lot of attention to you, but other students might prefer to have a PI more hands-off and like just meet monthly or even once a semester or once every 2 months. So I will say that just get to know or have in mind what you will prefer to have in your mentor and go from there, like and try to see and like look for your rotations in that way, right? If you and if you already done your rotations, analyze the mentoring style that you observed, that mentoring style fits with you.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything that Ela said. I think you'll find that like, even if you don't necessarily know what mentoring style works for you, like right now, especially if you're just starting, I think as you go through rotations, you kind of start to figure it out pretty quickly. Like, yeah, if you want a more hands-on PI, like a more hands-off PI. So I think that's really important, like just identifying the mentorship style that works best for you and like seeing what fits under it. And I think for that, again, going to students that are currently in the lab is a really good idea. Like they'll give you an honest perspective of like, here's like what the PI expects us to do from like a mentoring point of view. Like they tend to work with us a lot, or like, oh, they're actually a bit more hands-on. I think they'll also have a good idea of what the future of the lab will look like, right? Because especially like for a smaller lab that's growing, like kind of like my lab, where it's like when I joined, it was like kind of small and we're starting to grow. Like things will probably change as it evolves, right? Like you might get like a little bit less hands-on than when you rotated. So yeah, talk to the graduate students, get like a good sense for like what their relationship with the PI is in terms of like the amount of time that they get with them, how often they meet with them, because they'll be able to tell you better than anyone else because they're in your shoes or the shoes that you want to be in. And also like kind of like an addendum to that, also consider the lab when you're choosing your PI, because that's also really important. I think like choosing an environment that works well for you, you'll find that there, at least I found in my experience, that the lab will often tend to reflect a lot of like the personality or like flair of a PI. Because like will attract like. And so I think like keeping that in mind as well, because like those are the people you're going to be working with in addition to your PI. So like, you know, especially like if you're going to have a more hands-off PI, you're probably going to want to like put even more emphasis on like what the rest of the lab is like, because that's probably who you're going to be working with more. So yeah, make sure you consider all that in addition to just the PI themselves when you're deciding what lab you want to join.
Yeah, if I could add really quickly to that, so something that I was advised, and I also advise to first year students, is to the 3 major things that you have to take into consideration when you choose a lab is PI, lab environment, and research. And if you like, I will say that in that specific order, because PI, if you have a really good PI and a PI that actually cares about you, even though the lab environment or even the research, because we know science doesn't go well all the time, if those things are not really good, then your PI, if it's a good mentor, it will help you. And lab environment, it's also important, because if the PI is not around, and also you're going to spend like at least 8 hours a day in the lab. So if the lab environment, if you don't like the lab environment, it's going to be a stressful situation. So it has to be, you have to agree with the lab environment. And well, the science is also important. At least you don't have to know everything in the field by like at the beginning, but at least you have to get the feeling that you like, that you see yourself in that field for at least the next 4 to 5 years. That's important.
Okay, guys, we're gonna start wrapping up. Thank you, Julio and Ela, again for your time and all your great discussions. If everybody could please fill out the post-panel survey if you haven't done so. And if you have, then thank you for coming, and we hope to see you in our next panel.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye.